Charles Kenny is Senior Fellow at the Centre for Global Development. Thanks for coming on, Charles. What do you make of the arguments over the aid spending?
Thanks very much for having me. I think, first of all, I'd say it's not an either or in this case. It has to be a both. I mean, take Ukraine itself. Obviously, we should be supporting the military effort of Ukraine. But another thing we've been doing, which has been vital to keeping the country operating, is providing economic support. We've been providing billions in economic support that has kept governments functioning, that has kept hospitals open. And by the way, we know we're doing it really effectively. We've got measures and surveys all the way down to the final consumers of this money to make sure that it's getting there. So this aid is delivering, vital services that are keeping Ukraine going during this terrible time. So you can't make the case that it's either defense or aid. We need both.
No, although that could fall into a different part of spending, couldn't it? I mean, there is a war-torn European country, an ally of ours, which we are coming to help. That's very different from funding various charitable organisations in parts of the world that aren't at war.
Fair enough, but one of the reasons those other parts of the world aren't at war is because aid helps make countries richer, and when countries get richer, the chances they fall into civil war dramatically declines. And we've seen, we've got strong evidence of the fact that more aid leads to faster economic growth. That's to say nothing of the fact that more aid leads to better protection against global pandemics breaking out. Aid was behind
how's that gone?
Because smallpox vaccinations anymore.
Yeah,
I could go on.
And how's that going? Because aid spending is roughly now 15.3 billion in 2023. It came down to 11 billion in about 2021, so it's back up to 15 billion. How's that going in preventing conflicts around the world, or indeed global pandemics?
One of the things we saw in the US last week was that the USAID has sadly stopped monitoring the monkeypox outbreak in Africa. If that spreads, I think you can point at aid being cut back.
What about the World Health Organization? That's their job.
Well, of course, President Trump has decided that the US should leave the WHO as well. So
yes, but it's not the only signatory to the WHO, and the WHO's job is to look after those,
to finance that work.
Yeah, but the WHO's job is to monitor those outbreaks, and it does so regularly. I get their emails on it, so that's their job.
Yes, but it's paid for by assistance by the ODA budget.
Some of it is, but not all of it. Could the WHO not function without America's aid spend on it?
Could the WHO function without any of its voluntary commitments? It would be a lot smaller, and it wouldn't be doing most of the work it's doing.
Do you think that one of the things that people need in order to garner more support for this is to show that this investment is working?
Yeah, I think that's fair. Of course, people should know that the investment is working, but actually we have a huge amount of evidence that it is. Sadly, we're getting more evidence that aid works at the moment because we're seeing, thanks to the stop work in the United States, we're seeing people go off their antiretroviral drugs and their HIV burdens going up. We're seeing emergency food aid rotting in ports rather than getting where it's needed to feed kids. We've got a huge amount of evidence that this aid does work to deliver outcomes. Maybe we all need to do a better job of providing that evidence to the general public, but it's there.
Really good to talk to you. Thanks for coming on. Charles Kenny, Senior Fellow at the Centre for Global Development. 6:10, James Price is a former Conservative Special Advisor. Thanks for coming on the programme, James. The Conservative government under various administrations put a legal requirement of spending 2.5% of GDP on foreign aid. Why should that change?
Well, thank you for having me on. I think that having any kind of particular requirement about what a government should spend is wrong. What happens if you don't have enough to make your requirements on that? What happens if you have too much money left over? I think it's a poor way to do it anyway. And I fear that it was a bit of what I suppose now is called virtue signaling, which is much easier to do when it's not your money, but taxpayers. So I think that's wrong in the first instance. And listening to your previous contributor, I would challenge some of this stuff. Of course, some important work gets done, but a lot of the horrendous waste that is discovered in this USAID exposures. You talked about the explanations for local Afghans to learn about French conceptual art and whether a urinal counts as art or not. I'm not quite sure that's most useful for people
$1 million
living in the breadline in Afghanistan. Well, exactly. And that's many people's families' worth of taxes in America. And they don't get free healthcare and things like that in America. And similar waste is discovered all the time in the British aid budget. And that's before we come on to obviously the very rapidly changing geopolitical scenarios around Europe and European defense at the moment.
To what extent is there a very, very healthy industry in aid? There are lots of companies who get given similar contracts. There aren't many of those companies. They make a fortune.
Yeah, absolutely right. These people were very, very good at understanding when it was the Department for International Development, DFID, before it got folded into the Foreign Office, were very good at working out exactly what you had to say on the forms to get the right kind of stuff. And I think, I'm afraid, charities were the same as well. I'm not sure that any charity that relies mostly on grant funding from government should really be called a charity, for example. And I think the real tragedy is that, look, there is some important work that's done around these areas, but the huge, horrendous, egregious waste that we see ruins it for everybody else. And this idea that aid spending prevents pandemics. Well, China is a heck of a lot richer than we are. Pandemic came out of China. And yet, by the way, until recently, we were still giving aid to China. We're still giving it to India with its space program. They're taking people's money for a ride here. And it's absolutely outrageous at a time when we've not clearly on the whole continent been spending nearly enough on defense to deter Putin, whose economy is only the size of the Spanish economy, from invading a chunk of Europe and us relying on American taxpayers to look after us as well.
But I've got to put it to you, James, that the former lead civil servant in the Foreign Office worries about Britain's reputation on the international stage if we were to go ahead with this.
Yes, we've seen Britain fall down some soft power rankings recently, and we've lost place to China. I wonder how many Ethiopian Spice Girls the Chinese have funded, how many bits of sovereign Chinese territory have they given away, the way that David Lammy and Keir Starmer are desperate to give away the Chagos Islands. By the way, there's a few quid we could save. We're giving more money to Mauritius, by the sounds of things, than our entire aid budget for the year. We could cancel that, for instance. And unfortunately, the only thing that we're known for in Britain at the moment around much of the world, certainly you talk to any Americans, is the scandal of the grooming gangs that has reared its head again. Until we can get our own house in order, deal with our own issues, and start funding our defense properly, we shouldn't be sending this money out the door. That, by the way, was the warning, of course, of J.D. Vance. I don't like what he and Trump are saying in their kind of callousness about Ukraine, but their criticisms about Europe, when we've not been paying enough money for our own defense, they ring pretty true. We should sort our own house out first.
Thanks for coming on. James Price, former Conservative Special Advisor. The realities are these. There is no growth in the economy, certainly nowhere near anything that anyone would consider important. We have to spend more on defence. The Trump administration made that very, very clear. Europe's interests are not America's interests. We're going to have to spend more.